Good morning. Today we're going to be reading the book The Curious Garden. And I know in science you've been learning about life cycles and plants as well. So this book is a book that is based on an actual garden. However, the story is made up. So this story is fiction. Fiction is make-believe. But it's based on a garden that did actually exist. And I'll tell you some more about that at the end of the book. But think about all the things you know about plants and what they need to survive. I know you've already talked about that. And in this garden, you see that, and you see as the seasons change, how the plants change and how some of them come back. This is The Curious Garden by Peter Brown. And one thing that's really neat about this book is I ordered this book years ago, used, and just by chance, I got a signed copy, signed by the author, signed to someone else, not to me, but a signed copy by Peter Brown, the author and illustrator. There was once a city without gardens or trees or greenery of any kind. Most people spent their time indoors. As you can imagine, it was a very dreary place. However, there was one boy who loved being outside. Even on drizzly days while everyone else stayed inside, you could always find Liam happily splashing through his neighborhood. It was on one such morning that Liam made several surprising discoveries. He was wandering around the old railway, as he did from time to time, when he stumbled upon a dark stairwell leading up to the tracks. The railway had stopped working ages ago, and since Liam had always wanted to explore the tracks, there was only one thing for the curious boy to do. Liam ran up the stairs, pushed open the door, and stepped out onto the railway. The first thing he saw was a lonely patch of color. Wildflowers and plants were the last things he had expected to find up there. But when he took a closer look, it became clear that the plants were dying. They needed a gardener. See, there's Liam. Liam may not have been a gardener, but he knew that he could help. So he returned to the railway the very next day and got to work. The flowers nearly drowned, and he had a few pruning problems, but the plants patiently waited while Liam found better ways of gardening. You can see he's singing to his plants. As the weeks rolled by, Liam began to feel like a real gardener, and the plants began to feel like a real garden. Most gardens stay in one place, but this was no ordinary garden. With miles of open railway ahead of it, the garden was growing restless. It wanted to explore. The tough little weeds and mosses were the first to move. They popped up farther and farther down the tracks and were closely followed by the more delicate plants. Over the next few months, Liam and the Curious Garden explored every corner of the railway. You can see, here's a picture of Liam on top of the railroad with his garden, which is growing. Here's another picture of him looking out at the city from his garden. After spending his spring and summer and autumn with the garden, Liam's time on the railway was finally interrupted by winter. Heavy blankets of snow fell on the city that season, and for the first time since he'd become a gardener, Liam could not visit the plants. Rather than waste his winter worrying about the garden, Liam spent it preparing for spring. After 3 cold months, the snow finally began to melt, and Liam rolled his new gardening gear over to the railway. Winter had taken a toll on the garden. But thanks to Liam's planning, his handy new tools, and a little help from the sun, the plants soon awoke from their winter sleep. The garden had always wanted to explore the rest of the city, and that spring, it was finally ready to make its move. Once again, the tough little weeds and mosses set out first. They popped up farther and farther from the railway and were closely followed by the more delicate plants. The garden was especially curious about old, forgotten things. A few plants popped up where they didn't belong. Others mysteriously popped up all at once. But the most surprising thing that popped up were the new gardeners. So now it's not just Liam. We have a whole lot more gardeners. I love this page because if you can look, you can see all the gardens that have popped up in really neat places. Like you see the lily pads, you see stairs carpeted with grass. You see these cool animals made out of grass. You can see gardens all over the place. Many years later, the entire city had blossomed. But of all the new gardens, Liam's favorite was where it all began. And here's a picture of what the city would look like. And I do want you to compare it to the beginning of the book, where we saw the gray city. Let's see if I can find the right page. Looking like this. And you can see, once the gardens appeared, how the city changed. And that's the end. This book, like I said, is based on an actual garden. So there was a railroad line in New York City called the High Line Railroad. And it was an elevated railroad. And they stopped using it in the 1980s. And so the railroad track just was left abandoned and stuff sort of grew wild on it. But some people started to